In the busy, overcrowded, and highly competitive world of today, much of the story of mankind is recorded in terms of statistics. Statistics measure everything about us, from our average height to our average income. They compute the number of steps we will take in the course of 1 year, or the number of miles we will ride in buses and taxis. Much statistical data is inconsequential. Columns of numbers evaluating trivia, measuring the unimportant fringe factors of life. But other statistics are all too significant, focusing a harsh light of reality on the grim shadows that dog humanity's footsteps. The urge for self-destruction walks in step with thousands of those who make up our civilian population.
Remember folks that tomorrow is a day of total fire ban for the whole of Victoria, and restrictions will remain in place for the rest of the week as the fire department battles several out of control blazes throughout the state. Emergency officials are warning of catastrophic fire weather conditions ahead over the next week in what has been a record-breaking summer for Australia, and as the country sizzles down south and floods up north with a Category 5 Cyclone Mary about to make landfall over Cairns, with the highest speeds ever, or wind speeds ever recorded for a cyclone at 457 kilometres an hour. Now this is smashing the previous record by almost 50 kilometres an hour. Now that's all for the weather folks, and you're listening to Yarra Valley FM 99.1, and today is International Suicide Prevention Day. And as part of our efforts to help prevent this very sad occurrence of suicide, I have with me in the studio Peter Charles Downey, director of the thought-provoking new documentary Surviving Earth, which is basically about mass suicide prevention. And of course, for the people listening out there, don't forget you can call in at any time with any questions you may have for Peter about the film. So welcome to the studio, Peter, and thanks for being with us today.
Oh, thanks for having me in today, Mark, and hello to everybody listening.
So I thought Surviving Earth was a fascinating and it's just a fantastic, important environmental and humanitarian film. Would mass suicide prevention be a correct description?
Yeah, basically, Surviving Earth is about trying to prevent the mass suicide of humanity from a human-induced resource depletion, environmental degradation and climate change. So to prevent humanity from killing itself by killing our host, the Earth, our mother. Humans are a part of nature, and at the moment we're like the part of nature, called the Earth, that is trying to kill itself. Now, all those nuclear bombs we have pointed at each other, and it's sort of like the Earth pointing a gun to its own head. Mark, I think one of the scariest realities facing humanity right now is that we are artificially sustaining 7 billion people with industrial scale everything because of the potent energy of one-use-only fossil fuels. Fossil fuels that, along with many other important minerals in our civilization, are all in decline. From the artificial ingredients in our manufactured food to the artificial veneers on our homes to an artificially sustained population. I think the foundations of our civilization are destined to fail, and I think we need wisdom to step in and take leadership here before it's too late.
The viability of the current population is based on a presumption that we can continue to mass produce food using petroleum and other synthetic additives like nitrogenous fertilizers, and continue to transport the food from where it's produced to where we live, because more and more of us live in the cities remote from food production.
The agricultural system that we've inherited through the Industrial Revolution in the last couple of centuries is now very dependent on a high energy input, and nearly all of that comes from fossil fuels. And it's sometimes said crudely that what we're eating these days is in effect coal and oil, We need to put in about 5 to 10 units of energy from those sources in order to produce 1 unit of food energy. So the system is very energy inefficient, and that's really because we've relied on that sort of artificial subsidisation of the system.
And so we basically eat oil. I mean, if we don't actually recognise that, then you have a major weakness in the system, because as oil starts to become constrained, we're not going to have that ready availability to continue agriculture in quite the same way.
I go back to natural systems. Let's look at rabbits. Rabbits will move in, let's say there's a bumper rainfall and a particular field grows a lot of food. Rabbits will move into that environment and they'll consume everything they can, right? And in doing so, their population will be sustained and it will increase. But when all the food has been eaten a lot faster than it can regrow, then we have what's called population overshoot. And the natural pattern for that, the well-established pattern that happens many times, is there's a die-off. Right. What we have become dependent upon is a non-renewable natural resource. Once it's gone, it's gone. But there's now, at this time, 7 billion people that need to be fed, that need to live, and what we call industrialization allows so many people to live on the planet and to live in as densely populated cities as we do.
Now, it's a pretty frightening diagnosis, and I found it all the more frightening because your film presented it all in a fairly logical way. It's not some doomsday conspiracy, it's actually just plain mathematics.
Yeah, that's right. Life naturally takes the path of least resistance. And like every other species, humans naturally pick the lowest hanging fruit first, as in consume the resources and minerals that are easiest to get to and of the highest quality or highest grades first. But today, all that low-hanging fruit is gone, and we keep needing longer and longer ladders to reach what remains, which is it's more expensive, it's more dangerous, it's more environmentally unfriendly, and it's much more energy intense. At the same time, as more people want them and are reliant upon them. So there's an obvious wall we're about to hit here.
Now, it doesn't mean that we have run out of oil. The typical production curve of an oil well is a bit like a bell-shaped curve. You find the oil initially, you explore, the production goes up, you reach a sort of a plateau, and then it starts to drop off because of the natural decline in the oil reservoir. Now, if you then aggregate all of the reservoirs in a region and then globally, you get the same sort of bell-shaped curve. Now, when you reach the peak, it's the point at which we've used up about half of all the oil we will ever produce. And that's roughly the point we're at today. It means that we haven't run out, but what it does mean is that the oil from now on is going to get harder and harder and less available. And if you have more and more consumers coming into the market, then there's a question, well, who is going to get the oil that is available? Whether it's us, or it's going to be the United States, or the Chinese, or the Indians. How do we allocate it? So this poses major problems for the way in which the world works, because we've been accustomed to having free availability of oil, no problem. And those days are now coming to an end.
Peak oil is certainly as big a problem as climate change, arguably a more urgent problem because most of the impacts of climate change are taking decades to unroll, whereas the impacts of peak oil are happening now. The relationship to climate change is, given our failure to plan for a transition away from cheap petroleum fuels, there's an urgent political priority to bring on stream alternative transport fuels, which are usually more environmentally dirtier, worse in carbon terms. I'm thinking of oil from shale or coal seam gas or gas liquefaction.
And perhaps you can explain to the listeners about the concept of energy density. I hadn't heard of this before.
Sure. When we collect sunlight in a solar panel, we're collecting that one day's worth of sunlight energy to use or store. But when we use fossil fuels, we are using thousands of years worth of sunlight energy locked away in that fossil fuel, which is called energy density.
Now, effectively what the use of fossil fuels has meant is you leverage the ability of humanity to do more work, because the energy is incredibly densely packaged.
That's a very good question. I mean, in the short term, you can't compete economically because when we burn coal, we're taking advantage of something that was stored over thousands of years, whereas when we use solar energy directly, we're just using the flow that's happening at the moment. On the other hand, those natural flows are literally thousands of times greater than human energy needs, and the rate at which solar energy hits the Earth is about 10,000 times human energy use. So yes, in the short term, coal is cheaper, particularly if we don't charge them for the fact that they're changing the climate and imposing costs on future generations. But in the long term, there's no question that we could meet all of the material needs of human society on natural flows. And if you're thinking about a future sustainable society, that's the transition that has to occur. And if you think about slowing climate change and keeping it to an acceptable level, it's a transition that has to occur as a matter of urgency.
I think there's an element of social denial involved. If you were to say model the human race into a single individual, it's like we're dealing with an obese teenager that's addicted to crack. Right, we've got to kick the habit and then lose some weight. Now they're very difficult tasks to do. Now an addict in that situation will not do that until they're forced to do it, or something inside them makes them do it. We've yet to hit that point. And because the implications of population overshoot are so dramatic, we tend not to, almost as a group, we refuse to look at it.
That the world is overpopulated. I mean, there's just too many of us.
You know, Mark, all the people we interviewed sort of all agreed that overpopulation was the elephant in the room that no one wanted to talk about.
Well, there's no question that it's the elephant in the room. It is not covered in the media. It is not covered by our politicians. They'll never discuss it. And I think for a variety of reasons, but one of them is that there's a huge religious pressure against discussing it, and the growth manic economic system discourages any discussion of something that might possibly stop the rich, really rich people from getting even richer.
The population issue has really been under a sort of a veil internationally.
Well, it's very curious. The media shies away from it immediately, and all politicians shy away from it. So we've got to try and overcome that reluctance to even discuss the dirty word population.
That's the problem, is that we don't want to talk about population. And I think that the only way we can help to create positive change is just to start discussing it. Because, you know, people, it's all well and good to think, well, one day someone will solve the problem. But that one day has to come soon, otherwise our whole world will collapse. So it's really important that we start talking about this issue.
I was born in 1930, probably look like it. And in 1930, there were only 2 billion people on Earth. And today there are 7.1 billion. And if things don't go quite right, we'll be up to 10 billion by the end of this century. And that will just be indescribable, the damage that we will do to the environment if that happens.
Now, the other thing that goes on at the moment that is making the population larger is the fact that we're living longer lives. So it's not just a matter of putting a condom on the whole world. You also have to deal with this increase in the number of older people in the world. And that's much less easy to deal with than contraception. I mean, presumably we're not going to advocate euthanasia or something like that.
Yeah, with the ageing population, there is a debate going around that if we don't have more young people, they won't be able to care for our ageing members of society. This is a trap that we're going to fall into. So if we have more kids to take care of our elderly, then when these kids get old, we're going to need more kids to take care of this. It's just an ongoing problem. Exactly. It's going around and around in circles until we build ourselves into this hole. We can't get out.
I wonder if we can spend some time now to discuss climate change and how climate change is going to exacerbate all the other problems that we're talking about.
Yeah, sure, Mark. It's no longer a question of if there will be climate catastrophes. They're already happening. We're already seeing them. It's more of a question of how bad do they have to get before we change. It's like how big a kick up the arse do we need, and before we change gears here.
Look, climate change is not unstoppable. We're still in that window of opportunity, particularly in this decade, where if we fight hard and reduce our dependency on fossil fuels, we have a significant chance of avoiding dangerous climate change. But things are perilously close, and Despite all the programs that have been put in place by every developed nation in the world to reduce greenhouse gases, it's still not enough now to avoid dangerous climate change. We would need to double our effort in order to do that. So Australia's got a 5% reduction target. That would need to be at least 10, if not 15%, in order to have a chance of avoiding dangerous climate change. And every other country on the planet would have to come along with the same sort of reductions.
The rising sea levels are starting to impinge on food yields in the Mekong Delta, which is the rice bowl of Vietnam. The yield has fallen by nearly 1/2 now with the intrusion of salt water as the seas have been rising. Some of the infectious disease patterns are changing, and it's not just the ones spread by mosquitoes. We're seeing problems in many parts of the poorer world with outbreaks of cholera associated with more extreme flooding events, things that disrupt communities and local landscapes and overload the primitive sewer systems that many of these communities have. And of course we're seeing now an increasing number of reports of mental health problems in rural families and farmers in parts of the world undergoing stress from changing climatic conditions, falling farm yields, the displacement of populations. And in the longer term, realistically, we do face the prospect of increased conflict.
Yeah. And what about the other species that we're killing? I mean, are we going to be responsible for the 6th mass extinctions on the planet?
Yeah, well, look, we're wiping out species around about 200 per day. And this includes plant species that could have a cure for cancer that we've now lost forever as we're ripping down forest.
A few years ago, a very wise Nobel Prize winner, Crutzen, said the world has entered a new era, which a new age, if you like, which we should call the Anthropocene, because every single living form of life on Earth is now influenced by human activities. This has never happened before. So it's a new age of mankind, the Anthropocene.
Humans are now sequestering more than 40% of all the incoming net primary productivity. Okay, so this is all the energy and other productivity that comes into the Earth from the outside, basically sunlight, how that changes the system. So humans use a huge amount of that incoming net primary productivity. And so I think it would be bizarre to think that if you take more than 40% of that it wouldn't change the Earth, and wouldn't change the Earth in a dramatic way.
We're destroying the Earth's biodiversity. We're wiping out other species at 30,000 a year is the rate. We're reaching the end of many of our key resources. We're risking great insecurity in the world's food supply. We're changing the world's climate. We are certainly at risk of epidemic or pandemic disease, much more than we were because we're moving diseases around the world. We're also contaminating the entire planet with chemicals that we manufacture in a way that has never happened in the past. I mean, every single human being is now contaminated. So all of these things are coming together at the same time, and that makes it a very large problem, a wicked problem. However, there are solutions for all of these things, but we have to take all of them into account, not just one at a time.
Every time we lose an animal species, it's like losing a brick from the house. Pretty soon the house just falls down. And that's just the way it is. That's how it's always worked for eons. That's the way our Earth has been set up. And so that's why it scares me so much. I want to make sure that my children and my grandchildren live in a world with clean air, fresh drinking water, and an abundance of wildlife. That's what I want. And so I won't stop until that becomes a reality.
Because I believe from the teachings of my ancestors and my old people that everything is equal. And the mistake humans have made when we became materialistic, we put ourselves above that and have openly destroyed and boasting about it, destroying other forms of life, which is so important to our own survival. That's the ridiculousness of it. We are killing what's there to care for us. You've got to be rumma. It's crazy. What's the matter with these people? Where have they come from? Don't they know they are killing when they cut down the forest and kill the kangaroos and the emus and upset the water, contaminating the air we breathe? They are killing themselves. It's suicidal, self-suicidal. And the sooner we can become aware of that, because in our belief system we are caretakers for all that there is on behalf of our children's children and their children.
So it seems that we're collectively walking off a cliff to our deaths at the moment, Pete, with our eyes wide open.
Yeah, that's right, Mark. It's called willful blindness. And some people we interviewed even went so far as calling it a treason, what our politicians are doing by willfully turning their backs on the majority science.
I would charge them with treason to humanity.
I mean, it's like this. If your child was sick and you went to 100 doctors and 98 of those doctors all agreed and concurred upon a certain treatment, most people, parents, would follow the doctor's advice. But when it comes to the 98% of climate scientists, people are largely ignoring them and not believing them.
Well, if they believed in climate disruption, then they'd be taking action. But they're persuaded not to believe in it by a bunch of well-funded liars in newspapers like the Australian, the Wall Street Journal, the Fox News Network. In other words, you got to understand that if your kid, say your child has cancer and should have X treatment, there aren't a bunch of rich jerks who will come around and say, oh no, you shouldn't, it'll kill, the treatment will kill you. So it's a matter of politics.
And it's only if we as a community say to the politicians, this is a serious issue and we really want you to take the hard decisions now for the long term, that politicians will be encouraged, literally given courage, to take the hard decisions. And I think that's right, that we can't complain about politicians taking the easy way out if all of our decisions and actions say we're more concerned about having more road space so that there's fewer traffic jams than we are about the global climate.
But I think we're seeing our governments immobilised by the scale of the problems and the challenges that humans are now facing. They can't solve these problems. They're like dinosaurs in a tar pit of opinion polls and vested interests. They can't move. What we're starting to see is consensuses forming around key issues around the world, and especially young people are conversing with one another across all the old boundaries that used to divide human beings, across racial boundaries and religious boundaries and ethnic boundaries.
We're the next generation to be dealing with this. We have the ability to take a stand. I remember a few years ago, Mum and I sat down to watch a movie together, and it was a really old movie. It was still in black and white. It was that old. And so we sat down to watch it, and one of the actors said something that I thought was so haunting. He said that children should be seen and not heard.
Hey, that old one.
That old one. And I had to ask my mum what that meant, because in this day and age, I'd never heard of that. And she told me that back then kids didn't get to have an option or a choice, which I thought was really sad. And so today, as kids, we are in this extremely unique opportunity where we're able to stand up for what we believe in and stand up for what we know is right. So we shouldn't just give away that opportunity, let it pass us by. We should act on it.
But the point and purpose to be made here is that such tragedies are not inevitable. Prevention is possible. For, as you will see, the suicidal individual almost always provides clues that give advance warning of his intentions. Watch for these clues. Remember these clues. They could someday enable you to save a life.
Welcome back, folks. You're listening to Yarra Valley FM 99.1, and if you've just tuned in, I've got with me in the studio film director Peter Charles Downey, and we're talking about his new documentary, Surviving Earth. So, Peter, moving on to solutions now, and how we can treat this seemingly suicidal condition of humanity. I thought it was great that in the film you offered some solutions to the doomsday scenario we're facing, showing people that there are treatments available and that it actually doesn't have to be the end, or doesn't have to end in disaster.
Well, yeah, there is a glimmer of hope, Mark. I really believe that. It's slim, but it's there, you know. Humanity, we've got the technology, we've got the intelligence, we've even got the political and corporate will, amongst a few at least, to get ourselves out of this trap. But, you know, do we have the wisdom? This is the real question.
This is a great moment of opportunity. It may look as if we're taking a step back, as if government policy may shift, but it is a great energising moment, and the tide is with us, I can tell you that. Just think, 6 years ago, there was only 3,000 solar panel installations around Australia, grid-connected solar panel installations. Today, as a result of people voting with their wallet, there's over 1 million. That's 10% of Australians who have solar power. If we can make that 5 million in the next 5 years, we will have done a tremendous job in terms of reducing emissions. Last year we reduced CO2 emissions from the electricity sector by nearly 10%, which was a huge achievement. The simple truth is this, that we cannot leave a matter as important as climate change to the fickleness and whim of politicians. We must stand up and be counted, and we must be counted not only at rallies like this, but in using every effort that's within the law to slow the uptake of fossil fuels and every effort to speed the uptake of renewable energy, because it's those wind towers, it's those solar panels, they're the workhorses that make the difference. That's what's going to bring us, at the end of the day, and hopefully not too far away, a clean electricity grid that'll be powering electric cars and letting the world breathe a bit easier in this huge battle against climate change.
Now, on energy, I mean, how are we going to power everyone in the future in a way that doesn't destroy the environment?
Well, there's this fantastic group we interviewed called Beyond Zero Emissions. And these guys have come up with an energy plan for Australia of how we could replace all of our electricity needs with 100% renewable energy.
So Beyond Zero Emissions released a stationary energy plan, the Zero Carbon Australia Stationary Energy Plan in 2010. And that plan shows how Australia can move to 100% renewables right now. We don't need to wait. There's often the excuse put forward that renewables are not yet ready. They can't be baseload power generation. This report puts all of those myths, basically busts all of those myths, and shows that Australia can move to 100% renewables in a 10-year period using a combination of concentrated solar thermal, wind, solar, PV and bioenergy. And the myth is that these technologies are expensive, they're not ready, they can't be used 24 hours a day. Our report shows that these technologies are cost effective, they're available, they're cheaper than new coal and new gas, and we should be going for renewables right now.
The biggest problem we face is vested interests. We could be going renewable today on a big scale if it wasn't for the existing energy companies and the existing investments that have gone into fossil fuels that people want to pay off from. We don't live in a free market. There's government regulation and influence has a big impact, and everyone will protect their patch. So what we need, in my view, is a very, very vigorous, extremely aggressive renewable energy sector that will simply put those people out of business and do it through the free market mechanisms. And that's what we're starting to see develop, but not yet by any means enough. And we need to use every mechanism we can, just as they do. They'll use regulation, they'll use government lobbying, they'll use everything to stay in business. The renewable people need to learn those lessons and push back just as hard.
The Beyond Zero Emissions, we've just started a new project on Australia as a renewable energy superpower, and we'll be busting that myth that we need coal and gas for our economic prosperity. And we'll be also looking at the enormous economic potential to have an economy powered by 100% renewables and all of the investment and trade opportunities and job opportunities that would bring. Every country, using its own unique resource endowment, can also go 100% renewables, because it's no good if Australia goes 100% renewables and no one else does. There's no reason why every country cannot shift rapidly to its own mix of renewable energy generation.
What we now have to do is get the focus of public attention, investor interest and R&D effort behind all of these new industries so that they become, we develop the sustainable society. At the moment, we're not paying enough attention to any of those things.
And what about nuclear power as the answer to global warming? We're hearing a lot about that these days from politicians and even some notable environmentalists. Is nuclear the answer, or is it just more greenwashing?
Yeah, I've heard it said that promoting nuclear power as a solution for global warming is akin to promoting smoking cigarettes for weight loss. It's absolutely nuts. But just putting the climate part aside for just a minute, it's impossible to ever guarantee the safety and security of nuclear waste over the thousands and thousands of years that it needs to be stored for, when, throughout history borders come and go and countries get invaded, so you can't ever guarantee the security of that waste. And then, getting back to the emissions issue, it takes 15 years of emissions to build a nuclear power plant. There's emissions in the mining of the uranium and in the enrichment of uranium. And then, of course, you've got the whole issue that you can make nuclear bombs and the militarisation of the industry. And then, of course, you've got your Fukushimas and the absolute nightmares that can cause. So, I think nuclear is old school. I think it's like 1950s. It's old technology. And just like we need politicians who are not stuck in the 1950s, we should also move forward to something more modern, smarter and wiser to provide our electricity needs, like these, fantastic 24/7 baseload solar power plants. Yep.
As a young physicist, I was quite enthusiastic about nuclear power. I grew up in New South Wales, where people were regularly being killed and injured in coal mines and where the pollution from burning coal was obvious. And I actually went to the UK and accepted a scholarship from the UK Atomic Energy Authority to do my doctorate, because I was looking at a physical problem that affects the useful life of fuel elements in nuclear power stations. I've gradually become more concerned about the problems which you mentioned, and I think now nuclear is not a sensible response to climate change. Radioactive waste has to be stored for hundreds of thousands of years. So you're talking about a storage time that is literally thousands of times longer than any human society has ever endured. So you don't just need technical facilities that you're sure will last for geological time, you also need social structures that will far outlast any human civilization.
When the fuel rods are spent, they have to be stored. They're very hot and they're very radioactive, and they have to be stored in powered facilities to cool them down for 10 to 20 years after use. So when nuclear power peaks, because it's a natural resource and it goes offline, oil, coal, gas, all that stuff will have peaked a long time, a couple of decades beforehand. Yet we've now got an extraordinary amount of nuclear power rods that need to be stored for no outcome. It's going to cost a colossal amount of energy at a time when we don't have any. So if we do go down the nuclear path, we are making an extraordinary rod for the backs of the future peoples. It's not viable. Don't do it.
Now we've got our first caller on the line at the moment, and it is Lucy from Holmgren. Yeah, so what's your question for Peter?
I think you're a hypocrite, Peter, driving around in your car, burning oil, making a movie while telling people to stop driving and flying because of global warming or peak oil. And what do you think the plastic in your camera is made of? It's made of oil.
Well, Peter, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, well, Lucy, you're right. I am a hypocrite, no doubt. But I'm only a hypocrite because, unfortunately, I'm not Superman and I can't perform miracles, because it's actually impossible not to be a hypocrite when the fundamental ingredient within the technology of a video camera or a car or a TV or a computer is fossil fuels. What are we as concerned filmmakers, radio DJs, scientists, doctors and activists, wildlife warriors to do? Sit in our hands and do nothing because we're not allowed to use the tools provided. Fight a battle with one arm tied behind our back.
Well, and I guess that makes me a hypocrite too, Lucy, but hey, we've got to get this message out there somehow. Now, Peter, I wonder if you can discuss as to how we're going to feed everyone as resources decline and climate changes degrades agricultural land. Are GMOs the answer?
Yeah, look, this is a fundamental question mark. You know, there are 7 billion people on Earth, and 5.5 billion are here only because they're essentially eating oil.
Well, we are certainly facing a big problem because fundamentally we've got to almost double food production between now and 2050 to meet the population expansion from 7 to 9 billion or more. And we've got to do that when we're losing agricultural land across the globe at about 1% per year. And we've got to do it when many of the big aquifers that supply the food bowls of China, India, Africa, Middle East and parts of the United States are being depleted because they are irreplaceable. So those issues are very, very real. What we've got to try and do, though, is take cognizance of those issues and see what we can do to at least help reduce the problem.
Look, GM food is one tool in the agricultural toolbox. It's a screwdriver. It's not going to solve the problem. It offers some neat little solutions for some particular problems. But so far, it hasn't added 1 kilogram of extra food to the world's dinner plate. It will add some in time to come, but not a lot. So we are going to need other solutions to how we produce food than GM. If, as I expect, a lot of food will be produced in future in cities and in bioreactors and in algae farms and things like that, you probably won't need a lot of GM for that sort of food system.
I'm quite comfortable with genetic modifications that are essentially refinements of traditional breeding. For example, there's one experiment being done by people at Queensland University of Technology, which is basically blending a gene from a strain of bananas that is rich in vitamin A to make the bananas that are grown in East African countries richer in vitamin A to remedy a vitamin deficiency. I'm quite comfortable about that. I'm much less comfortable about ideas like putting a salmon gene in strawberries or basically creating new organisms, because I don't think we know enough about how organisms react in the real world. And we know from attempts to put into production crops genes for genetic resistance to pesticides, that these do jump to weed species, so that we're creating a range of problems.
Well, nobody knows for sure what the actual role will be of GMO foods or their overall safety. There's been some very frightening scientific results recently that indicate they're not all that great. On the other hand, if you can improve the vitamin content of certain crops and so on, that would be a wonderful thing to do. So it's like any other technology. You may be able to use it to be helpful, or it could be a disaster, and you got to pay a lot of attention and continually test to see what's going on.
So I wouldn't like to rely on genetically modified organisms to solve the food problem. I think there are other approaches to the food problem. I mean, I'm more confident about organic farming because that's going back to naturally occurring methods, and it's not doing a grand experiment that we don't know the consequences of. There's been 2 large-scale meta-studies, looking at the potential for organic farming, and they've both concluded that you could produce about the same amount of food by totally organic methods globally as you do now.
Look, I'll just give you one example, if I could, about how cheap, clean, renewable energy may transform our planet. Solar panels, a great example. Deserts are rich in sunlight. If you wish to grow food in deserts, you need water, but you can use electricity to desalinate salt water. So you could imagine having glass houses in desert areas with solar panels, which are desalinating water, which are running and regulating temperatures in the glass greenhouse system, producing abundant food in tiny areas. Now that may sound like a pipe dream, but in South Australia today, in Port Augusta, there is a facility that is actually doing that and growing tomatoes at very large scale in a tiny area using water desalinated by solar power. And that's the model for the world. And once that sort of thing starts happening, you'll find that the limits to food are simply not there anymore. That's not going to be one of the limiting factors in my personal view, once we've got cheap, clean energy.
What are the problems with biofuel?
The biofuel problem
is that the crops that are being grown to produce the sugars or the oils that are the basis of biofuels are all essentially the same crops that are human food crops: corn, soybeans. That world logically ends up with the cars of the billion middle-class people outbidding the rest of the population for their food supply, and then turning it into biofuels.
Now, I was really excited to see that you gave permaculture and relocalisation a plug in the film, because I think things like community gardens and the think global, act local philosophy they're really important steps to not only us transitioning into a less consumer-driven world, but also as a way of bringing people closer together as a community and building that community spirit. So what are your thoughts on this, Pete?
Yeah, sure, mate. To me, things like permaculture, relocalisation, and there's this thing called transition towns, these are things that people will be naturally drawn to as everything becomes more expensive due to resource constraints. Just like victory gardens popped up around cities during World War II, it'll happen again as we're forced to trade locally, because it will be the most energy efficient, cheapest and greenest way to consume and survive.
Permaculture is a design system for both sustainable land use, everything from gardening to broad-scale farming and forestry, but also sustainable living. So it's concerned with both the production side of the equation and the consumption side. I suppose it's a design concept, but it's also become a movement that's spread around the world about positive environmentalism, essentially. How we can create the world we do want rather than so much focused on stopping the world we don't want.
We need to have a philosophy of permaculture applying to entire cities. So cities need to think in a permaculture. So they need to recycle their water, their nutrients, and their energy. If they can recycle all of those things, then you have the potential for a sustainable city.
A lot of the fresh food production needs to move into the city. The areas of land required to do that are actually surprisingly small, because gardening, done well, is actually way more productive than broad-scale farming. It does require a lot of fertility and it does require a lot of water, but those are two things that are commonly available in cities. Often too much surplus stormwater and too concentrated an amount of nutrients, especially, of course, in human waste. So the recycling of human waste back to land, the replacement of all of the artificial fertilisers which all come from fossil fuel and depleting resources, using the natural available organic fertility where it is generated, which is mostly where people live, is all part of a cycle that can certainly support the world.
Oh, look, I think these things are absolutely critical. I mean, we did all this stuff years ago. I mean, even in my lifetime, I can remember doing all of this in a farm in the east of England, actually, way back in the Second World War. All that's going to come back, and it will be a lot more sophisticated than it used to be. I mean, we have an awful lot of knowledge, but the trouble is that the way urban development has gone, the way the movement of people have moved, people have become very much disconnected from the land and from the basics of how you actually survive. Now, I think that's starting to come back. If you look around the world at the greening of cities, you look at the permaculture movements, the transition town movements, I mean, all this is extremely good stuff, I think, which we need to encourage. I think it's very positive. It's particularly positive for children and so on, I think, who've been divorced from all of this.
One of the things that excites me is in the number of states that are now really almost legislating to have gardens in each school. And what you find is that when kids can actually get some soil, stick it in a test tube, wet it, put a light behind it, look at it with a microscope, and they can actually see the microbes functioning, big ones eating the smaller ones and so on. That's when you really get an interest in soil and food and everything else.
So I think, Peter, perhaps we should discuss how to deal with that elephant in the room, overpopulation. I mean, no one is going to put their hand up to be euthanised for the greater good of the planet, are they?
Well, everyone's very scared of what happened in China with the one-child family policy and say, oh, we don't want that. We don't need it because there is an enormous unmet demand by women for access to contraception. And we've been very slow to liberate the controls we have over family planning so that women can have free access to it.
And do they know why it reduces, taking the pill reduces mortality rates and makes you healthier?
Well, there's one very simple reason, that periods, menstruation, is abnormal. Because our hunter-gatherer ancestors and even our Aboriginal relatives here would very seldom menstruate because they were either pregnant or they were breastfeeding. And breastfeeding is nature's contraceptive.
I find it funny when people talk about controlling other animal species, because as humans, we do that. You know, we'll talk about controlling the like wild dog populations, or we want to control the amount of kangaroos in Australia. But we can't even consider the amount of people in our own species. I mean, and it's not so much as controlling our population, it's just thinking about it and giving people the option. So giving women the choice of family planning.
You know, this has been, as you said, the elephant in the room, and people haven't wanted to talk about it. I think we now have to open up that conversation in a much wider sense and start to look at sensible ways of doing it. I mean, they're there. I mean, we know how to do it. I mean, education is one of the most critical ones. Look, I think we are reaching the point where there's certainly going to be natural constraints come in. If you look at the degree of natural disasters going on around the world, the degree of conflict that's starting to emerge, I don't think we're going to get anywhere 9 billion people. But 7 is already too much.
Suicide is not a remote, rare occurrence. It has in fact become one of our most serious national health problems. But most suicides are not inevitable. Prevention is possible if the potential suicide is recognized and if we learn where myth ends and truth begins. Remember, suicide is not always sudden. It is almost always preceded by danger signs, clues indicating severe emotional disturbance and depression.
So welcome back, folks, and for anyone out there who's just tuned into the show, I've got with me in the studio today director Peter Charles Downey discussing his amazing new documentary, Surviving Earth. Now today is International Suicide Prevention Day, and folks, if you know anyone who is feeling a little bit down or depressed out there, don't be afraid to reach out to them and let them know that they're not alone and that help is available. But today on the show, we're tackling the bigger picture of mass suicide prevention of the whole planet. Peter, you showed in Surviving Earth that there are solutions to prevent humanity from collectively walking off a cliff like lemmings, but there seems to be so many obstacles getting in the way of that treatment. What are the main complications we have to deal with that are stifling the solution here?
Well, Mark, I think there's several main obstacles that are complicating the situation. One of them, I think, is that people are stuck in what I call uncomfortable comfort zones. I mean, I think most people know we're headed for catastrophe, right? You know, we don't change our ways, but very few people are really doing anything about it. You know, even the greenest people I know, still flying jets on holidays, are fully aware, you know, they're contributing to climate change. We love fossil fuels and the power they've given us. And even a poor person in Australia today lives a better, more advanced life than kings of old. You know, no one wants to give that up. Another complication is the economic trap, and the current crop of politicians from the two mainstream parties don't have any other game plan other than to continue economic and population growth, which on a finite planet we know is impossible.
Well, there's a couple of problems. One is inertia, that it's much easier to do what you did last year than do something different. The second is the political timescale, that saying we're going to convert to renewable energy is a decision that's going to take 15 years to bring about. So there's short-term political pain for long-term gain. And from the point of view of a politician who's trying to be re-elected, in the short term they're imposing pain on the community for what are alleged to be benefits 4 or 5 terms of office away. So there's no great incentive. But the third issue that very rarely gets discussed is the political power of the existing fossil fuel industries. And the fossil fuel industries have spent millions trying to muddy the water, trying to confuse the science or cast doubt on the science.
Well, I think it's very hard when you're in a world where people have been accustomed to standard growth since the end of World War II, and it's kept on going. We've all become far wealthier because of it, certainly in the developed world. We've been accustomed to all sorts of luxuries we never had before, or our parents never had before. When you get to the point of political leaders or corporate leaders or whatever, having grown up with that system, you get a bit of a group think where everybody tends to say, well, this is the way the world is and this is the way it'll keep on going. And you have a lot of vested interest built around that who rely on the fact that that actually will be the case. And whether it's mining companies, food companies, advertising companies, the whole concept of success in our society is built around consuming more or producing a bigger profit or selling more widgets. Now, the limits, planetary limits, mean that that actually isn't any longer possible. Now, telling people who've got to very senior positions that the world they have enjoyed right through their life is now about to change is not a message that a lot of people want to hear.
Well, I think the basic thing is that the people who are making money hand over fist now think they can continue doing it for a while, and they don't care at all about their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and so on. There's an ethical issue of how much you count the future, and they don't count it at all.
There are alternative models. People like Brian Check from the East Coast of the USA have been writing and advocating alternative economic models based on steady state growth, not on constant economic growth. And it's very hard for those kinds of alternative models to break through because there's obviously an enormous vested interest from business to continue with this impossible supposed boundless growth. Straightforward logic shows that that's not possible. It's simply not possible. We're not going to keep growing new planets.
Can you explain how Aboriginal people have a spiritual connection with the earth, whereby damaging the earth also hurts you spiritually, whereas a modern man believes in a spiritual connection with some heaven sort of outside of earth, yeah? And do you think this spiritual separation from the earth, of which we are made, is a major cause of our apathy towards or destruction of nature?
That's a beautiful question, because really our spirit only goes to the height the bird flies. Anything beyond that is one's imagination. Everything that's of important to us as human beings, we believe is here. It's here, right beside us. It's here on the land we're walking on. It's here with the trees around us. It's here in the air we breathe, in the water we drink. And that's the creator energy, what quite often we would refer as the chukupa. It is so much part of who we are that we have to care for that, for our own survival, because its survival depends on us and our survival depends on it.
Now, what about the crisis of our economic system and all the debt that needs to be repaid?
Ultimately, the debt is paid by the earth, because we have to dig things up from the earth, turn them into goods, and sell them, and then we save that money, and then we can use that money to pay back debt. The debt that we have created in the world is so great that there isn't enough resources on the earth to turn into products to sell to repay the debt, without absolutely wrecking the planet. So this whole debt-based money system is just as unsustainable as everything else, and we're going to have to think of a new way. Luckily, money isn't real, and you can just cancel the debt. You can print money, but you can't print oil. You can't print an apple, you can't print an orange. They're real, tangible wealth.
Now we've got another caller on the line. It is John from Mentone, Victoria. Are you there, John?
Yeah.
And what's your question for Peter?
Peter, I think man-made climate change is a load of rubbish. I think it's part of a new world order conspiracy to take over the planet.
Well, Peter, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, look, John, I think there's several obvious and scientifically proven ways in which humans are altering the climate. And one of them is our release of greenhouse gases, of course, which you don't believe, and that's cool. But, you know, you can also alter the microclimate of your backyard by planting or removing a tree. So, you know, as humans deforest the Earth at the rate of 16 square kilometres in roughly the time it takes people to watch Surviving Earth, you know, this has an effect on localised climate and the climate as a whole, because among the many things that forests do for the ecosystem, like attract rain, forests also create an evaporative cooling effect. So obviously the more forest humans remove, the hotter things will become just from that angle, let alone from our greenhouse gases, you know.
He's witnessed the devastating impacts of extreme weather firsthand. He's a firefighter.
Thank you very much, and what a great turnout today in Melbourne. Can I say that around Australia, firefighters are actually speaking at simultaneous rallies over this particular issue. Why? Because there is no skeptic on the end of a fire hose. I can tell you right now. I can tell you right now, firefighters' workplace has changed.
Now, Peter, as we've just seen, climate scepticism is quite high at the moment, and largely driven by the media, I think. And as you point out in Surviving Earth, the media have been a massive obstacle to people moving towards truly sustainable change.
That's right, Mark. I really think the people within our industry, the media, have a lot to answer for here with the huge amount of climate denialism that is out there. When the media present a climate change debate, generally they do it with a 50-50 ratio of climate believers to climate skeptics, in some attempt to appear even when the data is so overwhelmingly in favour of the scientists. And I think if the media are going to give the public a balanced presentation on the facts, the scientific facts, not opinions, then you have a panel of 10 people and you have 9 climate scientists to 1 climate skeptic, and then they'll give the public a more balanced view of what the science is, so the public can therefore make a better informed decision about, you know, their own future and the future of the planet.
Oh, I think you're entirely right that the media have been quite irresponsible by attempting to portray balance. I mean, we don't portray balance between people who believe in gravity and people who don't, or people who believe in medicine and people who think you'd get better if you were left to starve on a hillside. We actually prosecute people who withhold medical attention from their family because they're acting irresponsibly. We don't give them equal time on television to say that withholding blood transfusions or refusing surgery is a rational response in the 21st century. I think the media have given a totally misleading impression that the science is uncertain. Now, at one level, science is always uncertain because science is always a work in progress, but there comes a point when the science is certain enough to be the basis for action.
Can I make a really strong point here? 100% of climate scientists are skeptics, right? They do not believe anything. No decent scientist does, right? We go in there, we set up a hypothesis, is the Earth warming or not? We try to test it, we try to pull that hypothesis down. We find we can't do it in the end, that is a robust hypothesis. So we then use that knowledge to build another hypothesis. The climate skeptics are not true skeptics, right? They're people who refuse to recognise the facts, and science is good at producing facts. So really, the terminology is all wrong, right? Most scientists are skeptics. Those who proclaim themselves as climate skeptics are in fact not really scientific at all. So we need to ignore them and move on.
You know, as a young person, I watch, if you turn on the news in the morning, you'll see 9 times out of 10 there will be a record-breaking something. A record-breaking hurricane, record-breaking rains, record-breaking heat wave. There seems to be something's wrong. There's something wrong with that. You know, we haven't seen this much rain in 100 years, or on record. The earliest bushfires, and it just keeps happening. The earliest wet season in Cape York, starting in November. I mean, it's really, really scary. And so just for us observing things, you've got to go, well, there seems to be this trend of badness.
Now, I thought it was an important part of the film where you looked at war and its effect on the environment and its sustainability, which is rarely talked about in regards to climate change and other environmental issues.
Yeah, that's right, Mark. I think war is like one of the biggest obstacles that's stopping us moving forward with environmental issues, because it's like, no country dares back down from this, this arms race, which is inherently polluting and resource consumptive and environmentally destructive industry, and consume less energy and fossil fuels to become an eco-friendly nation for fear of being taken over or invaded. So then there's yet another trap that we're stuck in.
A fortnight's military budget in Australia as a one-off payment would be enough to invest in conserving our biodiversity for all time. I mean, what that illustrates is the scale of waste of resources that the military represents. And of course, once there actually is a fighting war, then the environment always comes off second best.
The story about the Arab Spring is an intriguing one, a tantalising one. On the one hand, there was an initial trigger from the extraordinary heat wave in Eastern Europe in 2010. And the extreme fires and heat in Russia, for example, which wiped out a third of their wheat crop. And Russia then said, okay, no exports. And the one country that really depends on Russian wheat is Egypt.
The Egyptian government was brought down originally by women who were out there protesting over the price of food. And that protest grew into a protest against the whole government, and they tore down the government. And really, in history, we look back in history, the Russian Revolution began with a famine, the French Revolution began with a famine. When people don't have enough to eat, they get bloody angry. And the Spaniards have this wonderful saying, there are only 7 meals between civilization and anarchy. And it's time that our politicians absorbed the sense of that.
The Syrian problem also has an interesting background in climate change, and in fact a historically very interesting one as well, because it's located in the area of the old Akkadian Empire from around 4,000 years ago, and it collapsed because of a severe drought that afflicted that region at that time. Food supplies ran out, hunger and starvation ensued, social disorder, and the system collapsed. Well, in northern Syria, which is the same part of the Middle East, we've also had quite a severe drought in the first years of this century, and also some ill-judged policy from the Syrian government to try to eliminate the traditional pastoralists with their sheep and their goats in that region, and replace the more fossil fuel dependent intensive crop production, which hasn't worked very well, but has left a lot of misery in that region and a lot of poverty and disaffection with the government. So here again, because of the effects of climatic conditions on human livelihoods, on human nutrition and health and survival, it culminates in political strife. And in this case, of course, in Syria, has contributed to what is now a dreadful civil war.
But if you look at, the examples in Syria and the Arab Spring, obviously there are big risks in where we're now going if you're getting to resource shortages and what have you. On the other hand, I think increasingly humanity is starting in some ways to come together and recognizing they have a collective problem. The conflict is actually not going to help very much.
As we move into a world of depleting resources, the effort to capture resources, because that's essentially what war is always about. It's not about ideology or any of those things of good and bad, never has been. That cost of capturing things goes up, and what you get back, even if you win, is very little because of depletion of resources. So eventually the learning for humanity is that as we move into a world of less resources, war actually becomes dysfunctional in that broader sense.
I think the more and more, in a sense, the more you get into the point of recognising you have a global crisis on things like climate, the greater preparedness of people to actually start thinking in bigger terms and to come together to try and do something about it. So I think that has to be the great hope as to where we're going forward.
Remember that most potential suicides can be helped. Assistance can take the simple form of friendliness, which might in some instances relieve unbearable depression and loneliness, and which we are all equipped to offer. Beyond that, we should direct the emotionally disturbed person to professional help. The chaplain, the general medical officer, the psychiatrist. These have been faces of fiction, but the tragedies they have lived in light and shadow are duplicated daily by flesh and blood people in everyday life. You may know one of them, today or perhaps tomorrow. If so, it is possible that his or her survival could depend upon your awareness of the suicide problem, your ability to recognize a serious emotional disturbance, your interest and concern in the troubles of another human being.
Yarra Valley FM 99.1, we're real, we're raw, and we're all yours. And don't forget that tomorrow is a day of total fire ban for the whole of the state, with catastrophic fire conditions expected, with a top temperature of 43 degrees in the Yarra Valley. And we're going to continue our conversation now with Peter about surviving Earth. So, Pete, I'd like to chat now about what you believe the outcome may be for our civilization and the Earth. Can you give our listeners the prognosis of your film?
Well, Mark, I can give you the prognosis from the coal company's point of view. Temperatures are going to increase due to the greenhouse effect. This is going to result in more ice melting. The oceans will become warmer and expand, and the sea's going to rise. You know, the coal companies know this, and they're actually preparing for it. For an example, you know, the land for a new third coal terminal in Newcastle, Australia, was raised a couple of metres to protect the coal from flooding due to sea level rise from global warming caused by the very thing that they're selling. It's nothing short of insane psychopathic behaviour. And it really shows the coal companies are fully aware that climate change is real. The coal companies are not climate skeptics.
I mean, look, it's crazy stuff. I mean, you get Australia talking about doubling its coal exports in the next 10 years, 10 or 15 years. At the same time, they're building new coal ports to do that, and they're now talking of raising the level of the ground level of those new facilities by a metre or two to avoid sea level rise coming from climate change. Now, what are we doing? I mean, we're exporting the coal to create the problem that raises the sea level, which means we've got to build the facilities higher. And we keep on doing it. Now, this is crazy stuff. And gradually it's going to dawn on people that somebody's got to join the dots.
And I don't think, from where I'm sitting and standing and looking, that there is any hope. We've gone beyond the level of pertaining life and a downhill slope into the future that will destroy every single one of us and every other living thing with us, unless the land in its own way can get rid of the modern human.
I think we should be doing a lot more about adaptation, because even if we stop burning fossil fuels today, the 0.9 degrees increase in average global temperature would go up to about 1.5 degrees just because of the carbon dioxide that's in the system, and will keep changing the climate for the best part of 100 years. So further climate change is inevitable, and so adaptation should be a priority. We really should be investing more in it. The science says that if we're going to stabilise the global climate at a level that's acceptable, most of the fossil fuels we know about have to stay in the ground. So it really is an issue. Are we prepared to allow people to continue making money, destroying the future of our own children and our grandchildren?
Well, I'm not an expert scientist, but what I do understand is that the safety limits for the general population in terms of parts per million of CO2 is 350. We're now up to over 400. That's expanding at about 2 parts per million per year. So patently, if we continue that way, we're going to have big problems. The question is what we can do about it. And I maintain that one of the ways in which we can help locally in terms of reducing temperature, CO2 emission and all that sort of thing is in how we manage our landscapes. And if we manage our landscapes properly by integrating the management of water, soil and biodiversity, we will have an impact on local temperature, on local precipitation through the normal photosynthetic process. But the other big thing I think to be concerned about is so much of the globe is now what I term an urban hotspot, just masses of concrete and macadam reflecting solar energy straight back up into the atmosphere. And what we've got to do, I think, is to green the cities in every square inch that we can, on the tops of buildings, on road verges, parks and so on, so that we get that photosynthetic cooling process going on that every tree or piece of vegetation does.
The true value of the forest is not reconciled. That over the years what's happened is that a substantial amount of government infrastructure has been built around what is demonstrably an unsustainable industry. So they don't see the value of the forest for water, they don't see the value of the forest for carbon, nor biodiversity, nor tourism. And so these other values are lost. And the reality is now the industry can't save itself. It's cut the forest too fast, too hard, for too long. And now we're not in a position to actually truly address the changes without a radical reform. And it's very like what happened with the cod industry in the Maritimes of Canada, where the cod fishers routinely say, why didn't the government stop us earlier? And of course it's collapsed.
Talking to other scientists as well, as we continue to chop down these vast areas of rainforest, eventually it'll get to a point where there's so few rainforests left that it just collapses, because it can't survive. They need that. It's been done for a reason. That's the design, is to have this massive rainforest, so it'll collapse.
An interesting thing that's now happening is a global movement for putting ecocide on the agenda of the International Court of Justice. And the reason for that is that the worst atrocities in the 20th century, like Hitler's mass murder of people that he didn't like, were actually justified by the laws of that country. And so we set up the International Court of Justice with the notion of crimes against humanity for which people could be tried internationally, even if it was legal within the framework of their own country. And I think it's a legitimate argument that ecological destruction, even if legitimised by the laws of a country, should be something for which people are held to account by the international community. So I think it's quite likely that we'll move into an era where those who are facilitating and allowing the expansion of use of fossil fuels will be held to account by the international community.
Now, I really hope we can make the changes needed, Peter, because it would be an absolute tragedy for humanity to come so far in the technological advancements and then lose it all through a catastrophic disaster we walk straight into with our eyes wide open, actually.
Yeah, you know, in the approximate 90 minutes it takes people to watch Surviving Earth, an incredible 5.5 million barrels of oil were consumed. Now, it's just a staggering figure, and the speed at which we're raping the planet is frightening. And yeah, it all comes down to overpopulation, overconsumption. We've heard it all before, but you know, no one's doing anything about it in any real serious way. You know, we have this sustainability festival in Melbourne every February, and Melbourne makes itself out to be some huge, you know, fancy sustainable city, when they want to change the building laws and turn it into a big Manhattan-style mega metropolis and add a couple of extra million people there, all living in concrete buildings, running air conditioners and coal-fired power stations. You know, it's just, we're kidding ourselves.
Indeed we are, and we've got another caller on the line. It is Clive from... Who have we got here? It's Clive from Palmerville. You there, Clive?
Yeah. G'day, Mark. Thanks for taking my call. Look, I'd just like to say that I think it's appalling that Peter's trying to cease Australian coal exports to developing nations. They're stopping them from enjoying the high standard of living and shopping we all enjoy here in Australia because of the fossil fuel industry, you bloody greenie.
Yeah, look, Clive, it's an absolute fallacy, right? That we can bring the whole world's population out of poverty and lift everyone into a middle-class consumer lifestyle when it would take 4 Earths of resources if everyone lived the way we do in Australia or America.
It is an illusion, and it's a dangerous illusion because the standard development model, which the UN now says is not sustainable, which the World Economic Forum now says is not sustainable, assumes that if economic growth continues, eventually everyone in Namibia or Bangladesh will live at the same level as Australians or Americans, and as you say, that would take 4 Earths. So the only legitimate future is one of contract and converge, in which we are using less resources per person in the affluent world. We live simply so that others can simply live. Sustainable growth is an oxymoron. Nothing can go forever in a closed system.
We really have failed to come to grips with the fact that there are going to be limits on what we can continue to do. Now, we have now reached the point where those global limits are becoming real. This was sort of flagged way back in the 1970s with the Club of Rome's limits to growth work. The core scenario of that work is actually almost exactly what's happened in the last 40 years. The problem is that in the next 5 years, according to that scenario, things start to fall apart because of the sorts of limits we're now seeing. So we now have to sort of come to grips with the fact that the rhetoric that's gone on for 40 years now has to stop, and we need some action to actually make things happen. Now, I mean, efficiency is critically important, but efficiency on its own is not good enough, because if you make things more efficient, people just use more of them. So the actual consumption goes up. So it's got to be efficiency combined with conservation, combined with an appreciation of the much wider problem we're trying to solve in terms of how do you actually manage to, or how does a population of 7 billion manage to live sustainably on a finite planet?
And what about electric cars? I mean, surely they're a part of our future.
Well, there's a problem with them as well. There's 1 billion cars in the world, and if we think we're going to replace the 1 billion cars with electric cars, that means we've got to go do a whole bunch of more mining, burning of fossil fuels, because it still takes fossil fuels to make a car, and it takes so many gallons of oil to make a tyre.
I have a clipping I used to show my students that said the electric car is clearly the car of the future. It's efficient, it's clean, it's quiet, it's non-polluting. All we need is an advance on the lead-acid battery as a storage technology, and that advance is just around the corner. It's dated 1903. And 110 years later, we still don't have a better storage technology than the lead-acid battery.
What, lithium?
Well, but not that's available on scale. And if you work out how many batteries you'd need for the entire vehicle fleet to be run on lead-acid batteries, we don't have that much lead. And we certainly could not, as far as I know, produce lithium batteries on that scale.
This idea of we'll just make more stuff, we'll be right. It's a non-linear problem, and we are painting ourselves into a corner without the resources to get out of that corner.
Yeah. And then the other problem with the electric cars is that the very few people can afford to go out and spend $50,000 or $60,000 on a brand new electric vehicle. If the government's serious about doing it, there would have to be a government-run or a government-subsidised factory producing these electric cars and giving them to people at cost price if we're going to make the transition in a timely fashion.
So I think our priorities should be in order: better urban design so that we have shorter journeys, more of the things that people need every day are within walking or at worst cycling distance. Secondly, better public transport so that the longer journeys are made using more effective means, and then we can argue about the propulsion technologies.
Now, Peter, the concept energy returned on energy invested is something I've never heard of until I watched Surviving Earth. Can you tell our listeners what this is?
Well, sure. Energy return on energy invested is a fundamentally important thing in our civilization. in maintaining and sustaining our civilization. For example, when we first began to drill for oil, for every barrel of energy we would expend, we would get 100 barrels of energy back, which was a great return. But today, now for every barrel of energy we expend drilling for oil, we get about between 10 to 15 barrels back. Now with something like tar sands, that's even lower. For every barrel, you get about 2 barrels back. And it's the same with things like biofuel. With something like corn-based ethanol, you're lucky to get 1 barrel of energy back for every barrel that you expend.
So energy, return on energy invested is the efficiency we can actually use our energy sources. Oil, for example, when they first started using it back in, say, 1900, for every unit of energy you put in, you got about 100 back. So its energy return on energy invested was 100 to 1, or thereabouts. Now oil is about 12 to 18 to 1, depending on what project you look at. Now, a good way of looking at that is you used to be able to just dig a hole in the ground and oil bubbles up to the surface, and it was lovely, sweet, light crude. Now, the very famous Deepwater Horizon offshore platform is now the norm, where they've got to go out to very deep water, and then they've got to drill 35,000 feet below the sea level to extract that oil out, and when it does come out, it's now what's called heavy sour crude, which needs more processing. So more steps are involved in the processing, and every step incurs energy.
Now, if you look at where we're going, the unconventional sources of oil, that's things like shale oil, shale gas, the tar sands in Canada and Athabasca, the ratios are all starting to drop to below 10 to 1. So the tar sands in Canada is probably 3 to 1. If the truth's known, it's probably about 2 to 1. Shale oil is probably less than 10. It's maybe about 5 to 1. Shale gas is probably somewhere around 10. And so you go on. Now what this really means is that the surplus energy that is available to run society is getting less and less per unit of energy you put in. If you look at the way that industrial societies currently operate, the surplus energy is the energy that's is available to run the system. So in other words, it runs your car and my car, the buses, the trains, it stocks the supermarkets and so on. Now if that surplus starts to reduce, then the whole idea of economic growth as we've known it, which is actually consumption, comes into question because you don't have enough spare energy to actually do all these other things. So the idea of growing the economy ad infinitum just has to come to a halt. Now that's basically what energy return on investment really means. It's an absolutely fundamental concept, but it's not something that is in the standard economic lexicon. I mean, there isn't any point in getting down to a 1-to-1 ratio.
You're listening to Yarra Valley FM 99.1, and today is International Suicide Prevention Day.
Every other creature that has ever gone into overpopulation and stressed its resources has had a population crash. So the possibility, the Peter Schnellenhuber scenario, where there'll be 1 billion or fewer human beings left, where 9 out of 10 of us will die over the next 100 years, is entirely possible. And we need to take it seriously, because otherwise, if we don't take it seriously, we won't do anything about it. But on the other hand, I think we will get some early warning shocks. We will see some cities starve. We will see some major famines. We'll see a few, wars break out, possibly nuclear, and they will be the writing on the wall for all of us. And we will suddenly start to say, wow, if we don't pull back from the brink now, we're going over it like a batch of lemmings. Are we Homo sapiens or are we lemmings? I think that we have got a long track record, a 2 million year track record in avoiding disaster. I think we have the brains to do it. Do we have the social structures? Do we have the cooperative ability? That remains to be seen.
It might sound simplistic, but basically, as a species, we're programmed to survive the present. That's what Darwinian evolution's all about. We're not programmed to survive some possible future. But the other thing that we've acquired through evolution is a brain that can actually foresee or imagine that future. And that ought to be giving us an additional advantage. We ought to be able to harness that power to say, this is what is likely to happen, folks, and to avert it, these are the things we must do now.
We have 20th century leaders thinking they can recreate the model that worked since the end of World War II in now a completely different world. And it isn't working. That's why the US and Europe has not been able to get out of recession. It's why we're starting to see major conflict in places like Syria and Egypt, which basically are driven by climate change. And it's a forerunner, of what might happen in a wider global context unless we start to address these problems. So what we need is a completely different set of thinking and different leaders. We need 21st century leaders who are prepared to now come to grips with us, which is why I argue that politics will not lead this. It's too difficult. So it needs progressive thinkers from across the spectrum who are prepared to start speaking out honestly and try to change the conversation into a completely different mode.
Some of my colleagues are pessimistic and say, look, it's too late for human society. And if you look back to the Limits of Growth report, they said 40 years ago that if the existing trends of growth in population, resource use, industrial production, agricultural output and pollution were all to continue, we would reach limits within 100 years, and the most likely result would be sudden economic, social and environmental collapse in the middle decades of this century. Dr. Graham Turner of CSIRO has done an analysis comparing limits to growth with 40 years of data, and we're right on track. But Limits to Growth also said that none of those trends are inevitable, and it's entirely possible to redirect the trajectory of human development onto a path that would be sustainable. And it seems to me that this is really the great challenge for our generation. This is happening on our watch. We know what the science is saying. We know that it's possible to live more simply in a way that would be sustainable forever. We know that it requires significant change, and it's really incumbent on us to tell our decision makers that what they're doing now is not good enough. What they're doing now is right on track for collapse if that's what they want to achieve, if that's what they want to be their legacy for history. They were the ones who produced the collapse of industrial civilization, but they also have a chance of being the ones who bent the curve, the ones who redirected the pattern of development. And I'd like it to be the legacy of our generation that we were the ones who forced the decision makers to make responsible decisions now, so that our children and our grandchildren have the sort of life that we've had.
Something I find personally disturbing is the commercial exploitation of Aboriginal cultures around the world by governments, using the Aboriginal image to sell tourism, whilst so many Aboriginals on the ground around the world suffer in poverty and ridicule and racism, and have lower life expectancies and all that sort of stuff. How do you feel about this, and what do we need to do to heal our relationship with the world's Aboriginals and reconcile the atrocities and genocides inflicted upon them?
Yes, I don't like that situation we're in, where our culture is being attacked at all levels, our language, our ceremonies, our land, for economical reasons alone. In where I live, it's a tourism industry that's growing there, and all energy is towards that alone. And that's at a township or new city that was built on tourism, Yulara. Yulara has value of things you want to use that's probably the highest in Australia, like accommodation, food, drink, whatever, and fuel. You know, that it is the highest. Yet not far on the sunny side, sunrise side of the rock, is extreme poverty. And they're living side by side. And it's not that we don't see, the government visit us every week.
The tourists don't see that.
The tourists don't see it. No, they'd be kept away from that. I wish they would open it up for tourist people to shame the government into giving the people what they need to have, just to be of equal status to other Australians.
And do you think like that a new world Indigenous sort of culture is going to evolve, or needs to evolve? Needs to. We need to take the best of the modern and apply it to the best of the old way.
We are all Indigenous people when we go back to our root of where we come from.
In my permaculture teaching, I have always said that the planet will look after itself when we step back far enough in the broadest sense. Now, some people might interpret that as an excuse for doing that damage, but what all of traditional cultures teach and what all of science shows is that we damage ourselves first.
Scientists who think about Earth systems and how they work fall into two broad categories. There's those who think that the Earth system is a self-sustaining whole, and really the model for that idea was developed by a guy called James Lovelock, who understood that the Earth maintained conditions suitable for life and developed a whole theory, wrote a book around this, and that theory is called the Gaia hypothesis. Then there's another guy called Peter Ward from Washington State University who developed the idea that in fact the Earth didn't operate like that at all. The Earth was extremely antagonistic to life, and life maintains a precarious foothold here, but then every now and again a species is thrown up or something happens that it plunges the system into chaos and mass extinctions occur. And Peter's view is that we are the latest one of those things, the latest Medea event, Medea being the Greek goddess who killed her own children, so the Earth killing its own species. It's a rather apt analogy, I think.
I think until we recognise the Earth and her ecosystems as a living homeostatic entity and afford her the same rights that we bestow a cat or a dog or a tangible god or even an artificial person we call a corporation, I don't think we've got any hope of balancing the damage over creation we so lawfully inflict upon her. We have these world trade agreements that legally lock us in to overconsumption and raping the planet. So the legal system's got to shift. And until we've evolved enough to appreciate the rights of the Earth and our role as humans within nature, I don't think we'll ever appreciate the rights of every human's equal place within the ecosystem of our civilization. I really believe a new wisdom, philosophy, spirituality, if you will, world Indigenous culture is going to evolve from this unsustainable modernity.
It's a big problem, and I think that for people just living every day, it's such a big problem that if we can say that it's not there and block it out, it's easier on us, because you feel like one person. But then I have to think to myself, well, I am one girl, I am one person, and I can make a difference. I can change my lifestyle and hopefully empower those around me to change their lifestyle. And then we've got positive change. You know, my dad was one man who changed the world. If one man can make a difference, you can make a difference too. And it's just telling people that. You can make it, whether you live in Hong Kong, in a high-rise apartment, or in the middle of the Aussie outback. You can change your lifestyle and affect those around you.
Peter Charles Downey, thank you very much for being a part of our show today and sharing your thoughts and vision.
Yeah, well, Mark, thanks very much for having me on the show, and I really hope the listeners out there gain something from it, and you'll get out there and watch Surviving Earth and get to know all the great people that we interviewed.